This office is determined to investigate and prosecute anyone who engages in sex trafficking, no matter how powerful or wealthy or famous you may be. No one should doubt our commitment on that.
As we close out 2024, let's reassess where we're at with the Sean Diddy Combs legal saga. From just horrific new claims alleged in a multitude of lawsuits to potentially an explosive piece of evidence coming into his criminal trial, to just how he might be doing in pretrial detention. We're going to set the stage for what is sure to be one of the most explosive and high-profile trials in recent memory. So as we come to the end of this year, let's think about where things currently stand for Sean Diddy Combs, the rapper, producer, and mogul turned criminal defendant. And when you think about it, my gosh, what a year it has been, right? 2 of his properties in March of 2024 were raided by federal agents to retrieve guns, digital evidence, physical evidence. It was shocking when that happened. His 2 sons were actually detained. They were handcuffed outside of one of the properties when this was going on. They weren't arrested, but they were detained as there was this large showing of force entering these properties. In May, CNN published a video of Combs purportedly beating his ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, in a hotel hallway from back in 2016, running down a hallway in a towel, kicking, punching, dragging her, throwing things at her. 2 days later, he releases an Instagram video seemingly apologizing for what he did.
I was f***ed up. I hit rock bottom. But I make no excuses. My behavior on that video is inexcusable. I take full responsibility for my actions in that video. I'm disgusted.
And then in September, everything changed for Sean Combs. That is when he was officially arrested out in New York, and he was charged with 3 federal crimes: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. And as described in the indictment, he is accused of namely, quote, that he abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. And it goes on to say that Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs' role at the Combs business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs' orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that Combs referred to as, among other things, freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, pleasured himself during, and often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. Freak-offs occurred regularly, sometimes lasted multiple days, and often involved multiple commercial sex workers. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substances to victims, in part to keep these victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes, unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept videos he filmed of victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. After freak-offs, Combs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. That was so significant when that came out because we had heard about freak-offs before in at least one other lawsuit, particularly I'm talking about Cassandra Ventura's lawsuit against him. But to have the federal government come forward and illustrate the freak-offs, it makes me wonder a few things. We still don't know all the evidence that they have, right? We don't even know what the videos and digital evidence they have consists of, but also this racketeering enterprise, this criminal enterprise. It can't just be Combs acting alone. As you heard, he had help, so it makes me wonder who all the cooperating witnesses could be or will be at his upcoming trial. By the way, we really appreciate you guys coming to us all year. And by the way, to get a little more specific here, because we haven't talked about this in a while, for the sex trafficking charge, that refers to sex trafficking of a victim 1. We believe that to be Cassandra Ventura. It involves things like enticing, recruiting, harboring, or transporting over state or international lines a person and using force, fraud, or coercion to have that person engage in commercial sex acts, meaning sex acts where something of value was involved, such as money or promises or opportunities. The prostitution charge is literally transporting an individual over state or international lines with the intent that that person engage in prostitution. And by the way, what is at stake for Sean Combs? Well, if convicted, the 55-year-old faces some very serious prison time. The racketeering charge alone, he could be looking at life in prison. If found guilty of sex trafficking, he's facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in prison. And the prostitution charge carries a max of 10 years in prison. Now, Diddy's trial is currently scheduled for May of 2025. His defense seems to be that all of this was consensual, that no one was threatened, no one was forced, no one was coerced into doing anything. I'm sure they're also going to argue that there was no criminal enterprise, there was no illegal conspiracy or criminal agreement, that maybe a lot of these people, these alleged victims, are coming forward because they have pending lawsuits, that they're looking for a payday. So I will say, from a legal point of view, they might have a way to argue against the racketeering conspiracy or sex trafficking. What might be the most problematic for Sean Combs, legally speaking, how do you defend against the prostitution charge? Seems like the most straightforward. If you procured sex workers and there's evidence that you transported them across state lines, and if there are financial and travel paperwork documenting this, that could be problematic. But look, these are the charges. And more specifically, where are we with this case? Well, the next hearing is set for March, and the prosecution indicated that they will plan to finish turning over evidence to the defense by the end of this month, unless, of course, there's additional evidence. And by the way, the prosecutors were kind of cagey about whether we can expect a superseding indictment here, meaning additional or amended charges. One of the prosecutors indicated to the court, Judge Arun Subramanian, that if there was a superseding indictment, it really wouldn't require that much additional discovery, additional evidence that has to be turned over. So not exactly sure what that means, if it means just there's going to be additional evidence that would be presented to support the current charges. Maybe there wouldn't be additional charges. Maybe it wouldn't change the trial date, but we'll see. However, I will say the reason that this is important is because it's been reported that a grand jury has been impaneled that is hearing additional evidence in the Combs case. In fact, an alleged witness, a man named Courtney Burgess, came forward, and he's somebody who's come out and said that he saw a series of sex tapes with Combs and celebrities, and that includes minors. And by the way, if minors are added to this criminal indictment, I think this whole case changes. I think his trial date gets delayed, but we'll see. Now, I will say, talking about the criminal case, the prosecution just got a major win. So Sean Combs' defense counsel was trying to suppress the 2016 videotape I mentioned, the one of Combs purportedly beating Cassandra Ventura. And their argument was, look, this was leaked to CNN, potentially by the government, and therefore it shouldn't be allowed into trial. However, the government denied being in possession of that videotape before CNN released it. And by the way, it would make sense the defense wouldn't want this to come into trial, right? Because it's one of the most tangible, concrete pieces of evidence, arguably demonstrating Combs' alleged violence, but also that Combs was running down that hallway wearing a towel. And prosecutors have alleged that there was a sex worker in that hotel room and that Ventura was trying to escape, meaning that this is prime evidence of sex trafficking. However, as much as the defense didn't want this to come into trial and asked Judge Arun Subramanian to hold an evidentiary hearing on this and whether this videotape was leaked and whether or not it needs to be suppressed, the judge denied that. Yes, Judge Subramanian recently wrote in an order, Combs has not carried his burden to show that the government leaked the video to CNN. Combs argues that the most likely source of the leak is the government, but he doesn't point to any sound basis for this conclusion. And Judge Subramanian also added that none of Combs' arguments for why the Department of Homeland Security, these were the agents that actually conducted the raids on his property, that none of the arguments for why the Department of Homeland Security was the source of that leak, none of them were convincing. None of those arguments were convincing. So it seems that that video is potentially going to make its way into this trial. But I will say this. Judge Subramanian has indicated, though, actually warned both the prosecution and defense that they and the investigators and law enforcement involved in this case, they cannot disclose grand jury materials or information or any other non-public information that could potentially affect Combs' ability to get a fair trial. and he indicated action will be taken if specific information comes to light showing that they leaked prohibited information. So everybody's been put on warning again. Now, putting all that to the side, got to talk a little bit about something else that's happened, the civil side, because while we don't know whether or not the dozens of accusers that have sued Sean Combs will be potential witnesses in his criminal trial, Combs has been hit with a flurry of lawsuits, especially recently. 3 men just filed lawsuits against him saying they were all victims of Sean Combs, all anonymous. You have one, John Doe, who says back in 2020, so only 4 years ago, he attended a Sean Combs party in the Hamptons, fell in and out of consciousness after taking a drink, and woke up to find Combs and his associates taking turns sexually assaulting him. Another lawsuit involves John Doe who claims he met Combs at a New York nightclub in 2019. He was invited to an after party at the Park Hyatt Hotel. By the way, that is the hotel where Combs was staying when he was arrested by federal authorities in September. But he claims once he was in this hotel suite with Combs and others, he was drugged and awoke to find Combs assaulting him. He tried to resist, but he couldn't. And even more in a deranged sense, in a disturbing sense, he says there were people in the room recording this assault. And then you have the other lawsuit from a man who says that he was assaulted by Sean Combs at the Intercontinental Hotel in New York in 2020 after working for him for years. And he alleges after the rape, Combs told him that going to the police will make him look like an idiot, and because he is Diddy, this man would never be able to prove that this happened. And that, by the way, is arguably not even the most disturbing recent lawsuit. We also have a woman who says that when she was 13 years old, she was sexually assaulted by Combs and Jay-Z at a VMA's after party in New York back in 2000. And by the way, if you've been following us here on Sidebar, we have been following quite closely the legal war between Jay-Z and the attorney representing this woman, Tony Busby. And that is something that we have dedicated many a sidebar to. It has gotten very, very, very ugly. But in a recent update, the judge overseeing this case, United States District Court Judge Annalisa Torres, called out Jay-Z's attorney, Alex Spiro, criticizing his, quote, relentless filing of combative motions containing inflammatory language and ad hominem attacks against Tony Busby, saying these are inappropriate, a waste of judicial resources, and a tactic unlikely to benefit his client. And moreover, this is important, Judge Torres ruled that this Jane Doe can proceed anonymously in the suit as of right now. She doesn't have to reveal her identity despite Jay-Z pushing that for her to reveal herself. However, I should say that could change as the case progresses so that Jay-Z and Combs can properly defend themselves and know who this person is. We've actually seen that in other Combs cases where Jane Does have been ordered to reveal their identity, so we'll see if that ultimately changes. But actually, quite recently, we had another lawsuit that was filed against Sean Combs from a woman who actually decided to identify herself, LaTroya Grayson. She claims that when she was 23 years old, she attended a Combs party in New York City through a radio contest back in 2006, and after consuming less than 2 drinks, she says she became sick, and the next thing she knows, she wakes up in the hospital. And when she goes back home to Oklahoma, she gets a phone call, and her complaint reads, the day after plaintiff returned home from New York, she received a call from a New York area code with an anonymous female caller. The anonymous female caller asked to speak to plaintiff. The anonymous female caller then threatened plaintiff, telling her that any attempts to pursue anything about plaintiff's assault would be futile, and plaintiff said she was confused and scared as she did not know what happened to her. Plaintiff, hearing from this anonymous female caller, was further jarring and traumatizing as plaintiff learned that not only was she viciously assaulted, leading to her waking up at a hospital, but that defendant Combs was involved, and plaintiff would be unable to seek justice for her injuries because of defendant Combs' celebrity status. When plaintiff tried to ask the anonymous female caller her name and how she obtained plaintiff's phone number, the anonymous female caller hung up. When plaintiff tried to call the number back, the number was disconnected. For approximately a week after plaintiff returned home, she felt constant pain in her private area, pain that she believed was from rough intercourse. However, plaintiff had no memory of engaging in intercourse with anyone. Plaintiff did not seek medical treatment or otherwise report her assault to law enforcement because she was scared and confused. First, because she didn't know exactly what happened to her. Second, because of the threats she received from the anonymous female caller of defendant Combs' involvement and it being a waste of time due to his celebrity status. And then we have another lawsuit that Combs was just hit with too. This is probably the latest one. A man named Philip Pines reportedly just filed a lawsuit against Combs, claiming that when he worked for the rapper and producer from 2019 to 2021 as his purported executive assistant, he was tasked with setting up these wild sex parties called Wild King Nights with lights, ice buckets, alcohol, drugs, sex toys, Astroglide, baby oil, very similar to the allegations laid out by prosecutors regarding the freak-offs. And then, after these parties, he says he was tasked with cleaning everything up. And when I mean everything, I mean everything. And also, by the way, that included wiping content from Combs' phones and laptops, paying people off, and keeping people quiet. That's one of the main allegations. Now, I will say in a statement to People, when contacted about Pine's suit, Combs' legal team said no matter how many lawsuits are filed, it won't change the fact that Mr. Combs has never sexually assaulted or sex trafficked anyone, man or woman, adult or minor. We live in a world where anyone can file a lawsuit for any reason. Fortunately, a fair and impartial judicial process exists to find the truth, and Mr. Combs is confident he will prevail in court. And that is true, right? He is innocent until proven guilty. He has not been found liable in any of these sexual assault lawsuits. So we have to always keep that in mind. He has a right to a defense. He has a right for his day in court. So again, we don't know whether or not any of these allegations or accusers will play a role in Combs' criminal trial. Maybe they won't at all. Remember, Combs is charged with specific allegations, mostly centered around the freak-offs, and for alleged criminal behavior from 2008 to 2024 per the indictment. And by the way, when we did a full breakdown of that Wild King Nights lawsuit, I made the point that out of all the lawsuits we've seen recently, in my opinion, Mr. Pine's account is the one that most mirrors the prosecutor's allegations. And also the time frame makes sense, right? 2019 to 2021. So it makes me wonder if he is in fact one of the corroborating witnesses for the government. Was he one of the people that facilitated all of these wild sex parties and racketeering activity? We'll see. But I talked about it on that episode. You can check it out on our YouTube page. By the way, one of the things we have to think about is how is Sean Combs doing, right? There's been reporting about what his meals are like, what his activity is like, what's been going on in the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center out in Brooklyn where he's being housed. There's a whole back and forth about whether or not materials that were in his possession were improperly photographed, all that. But I will tell you, Law and Crime's very own Elizabeth Milner was inside a courtroom for a recent hearing with Sean Combs, actually the latest hearing, and she relayed to us how he looked.
So when Diddy came inside, it was still that standard issued NBC jumpsuit. He's wearing khaki. From that video of, I think that was obtained by Daily Mail back in September, of Diddy playing hacky sack in Central Park, to now he appeared just astonishingly thinner, which you can expect to be inside a federal detention center for a couple months now. A lot different from the luxury lifestyle that he was living before, but he appeared very noticeably thinner, and maybe being locked up in detention is starting to wear on him. He appeared grayer a little bit as well too, but again, he appeared just like how you would expect Diddy to appear for a hearing.
It's so interesting to hear that because, of course, pretrial detention is no picnic, especially in the MDC. But it's also interesting because according to reporting like from ABC, when Combs was in that courtroom for that latest hearing, he reportedly said in court, "Happy holidays, y'all." And also he was apparently so polite to the judge asking, "Good afternoon, how are you doing today?" So just a seemingly upbeat attitude compared to what he's dealing with and what he's facing. And when I say facing, I mean potentially life in prison, potentially never stepping out of prison again. And why do I say that? Because one of the most significant updates in the Sean Combs case in the past few months was the issue of bail. Multiple judges have denied Sean Combs bail, and most recently, it was up to Judge Subramanian. And after hearing arguments presented by both the defense for pretrial release and the prosecution for detention, he ended up siding with the prosecution. As Judge Subramanian wrote in his order, the court finds that the government has shown by clear and convincing evidence that no condition or combination of conditions will reasonably assure the safety of the community. So first, aside from the allegations in the indictment as a basis of how dangerous Sean Combs may be, Subramanian cited that 2016 videotape as evidence of Sean Combs' violence and dangerousness, which is important in a bail analysis. Second, Subramanian ruled that Combs presented a serious risk of witness tampering, like improperly contacting a grand jury witness and trying to cover it up. Third, Subramanian says that Combs violated the Bureau of Prisons regulations in the MDC through having three-way phone calls or using other inmates' phone access codes, talking to people not approved on his contact list. In other words, he broke the rules while in the MDC, while he was seeking bail, and when he knew the government had already alleged he was reaching out to witnesses and engaging in obstruction, and yet he does this. So, aside from that, how can we even trust him to be on the outside? Fourth, this was interesting, Subramanian took issue with what he perceived to be Combs' lawyers making misrepresentations to the court about whether Combs' legal pads in his jail unit were actually labeled legal on it or not. That is all with respect to a separate inquiry on whether his rights were violated when photos were taken of those legal pads. And Sean Combs' counsel had said it was legal written on top of them. Then it seemed to backtrack a little bit. So it seemed that based on that maybe, look, I can't even potentially trust everything his lawyers are saying. That's a problem too. Fifth, even though Combs presented in what could be considered an attractive bail package of $50 million and a private security team to monitor him on house arrest in New York, Judge Subramanian wrote, the court doubts the sufficiency of any conditions that place trust in Combs and individuals in his employ, like a private security detail, to follow those conditions. And here's the final point that was brought up by Judge Subramanian, that Sean Combs is in a different position than, let's say, a Mike Jeffries, who's the former CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch, who was recently also arrested and charged with federal sex trafficking crimes in New York. Why? Well, the issue when it came to bail with Jeffries is that was more about him being a flight risk than so much a danger on the outside than we're dealing with Sean Combs. He had no criminal history. The allegations for Jeffries stem from a decade ago, and he's 80 years old. And also, there's no RICO or racketeering allegation in his case. So there was no way, in the end, to ensure that Combs would not be a danger on the outside or that he would follow the rules, the bottom line. And it appears that he has completely given up fighting for bail because after Judge Subramanian denied Combs bail, he apparently forfeited his right to appeal that issue to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, a higher court. And at one point, he had filed an appeal on the bail issue up there. And then he put it on pause while waiting for Judge Subramanian to rule on this issue. But in a recent filing, after Subramanian's denial, Combs' legal team wrote, Mr. Combs does not seek to appeal the district court's denial of his renewed motion and hereby moves to voluntarily dismiss the appeal. So yeah, he gave it up. And I think a fair argument for that would be that he probably realized it wouldn't be successful. And given the fact that this trial is just around the corner, there is an enormous amount of evidence to review. Maybe let's not spend the time and money trying to fight a non-winnable argument. Let's focus on my legal defense. Let's not focus on bail. It's not going to happen for me. Now, there are still things that we are waiting to see in this case. We are waiting to hear more about the evidence the government has, which we may not know until closer to trial, even though they claim there is a voluminous amount of material and that they're in possession of videos of Combs allegedly engaging in abuse or violence or illegal conduct. We still don't know exactly what they have. We also don't know exactly who the witnesses are or the alleged victims in this case, other than maybe arguably Cassandra Ventura. I've said this before, but victim one identified in the indictment seems to be Cassandra Ventura. Victim one, again, is part of that sex trafficking charge. And more specifically, the description surrounding victim one as laid out by the prosecutors, it seems to mirror Ventura's allegations from the lawsuit that she filed last year. But one thing we should look out for is whether Subramanian approves Combs' defense request for a bill of particulars. Now, a bill of particulars, I've talked about this before, is when a defendant says to the government, look, I need more clarity on my charges. I need you to itemize it out for me. I need more details of each charge so I can properly understand the case and defend myself. It's a way for a defendant to avoid being surprised at trial. And this is something, by the way, that Combs' defense team has asked for before, including they wanted to know the names of the victims in this case. Now, Combs' lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, asked during the most recent court hearing, for example, that the racketeering charge, it's so vague, and that the prosecution, they allege multiple acts of arson and kidnapping. What are these events? So he informed the court that we anticipate a motion for a bill of particulars coming to the court, basically saying we need more clarity about what's going on here. So we'll see if the court grants that. And by the way, when Agnifilo talks about arson and kidnapping, this is something the government kind of mentioned in their first letter. It seemed to be all in relation to the allegation that Sean Combs had blown up Kid Cudi's car, the rapper Kid Cudi, because he had been romantically involved, or allegedly romantically involved, with Cassandra Ventura. So again, a lot of moving parts. I'm sure there will be a lot that happens between now and May of 2025. We will see if that trial. And again, a lot happening in the Sean Diddy Combs legal saga.